But Emery Cowan comes to us from the journalism field, where she covered stories in Colorado and Arizona for the first 8 years of her career. And that coverage included the environment and topics such as forest restoration, watershed health, and public lands management. In 2020, she earned her master's degree in environmental sciences and policy from Northern Arizona University. And now she's the program manager for Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition. And she focuses on leading and coordinating peer learning across the coalition and using practitioner insights to inform policy engagement at the federal level. So I'm going to hand it off to Emery now to tell us a little bit more about her work and what her organization does.
Lovely. Well, yeah, hello to those of you who I haven't met. I'm Emery Cowan, program manager with RVCC, and I'm super happy to be with you today. Thanks for the invite, Ariana. Yeah, we can jump to the next slide. I was going to give a brief overview of RVCC. So RVCC functions as a learning network and policy coalition really focused on approaches that are place-based, collaborative, and integrate public and private land stewardship and rural community benefit. And we're guided by a leadership team of community-based practitioners, and those organizations are highlighted on the map to the left. But kind of our core pillars are learning, policy, and storytelling. So what that looks like is we produce various peer learning events and workshops. We have an annual meeting that is finally coming back after a 3-year hiatus in early November, so super excited about that. We also develop a number of different learning resources, and I'll highlight a few of those in the next slide. We do, as Ariana mentioned, policy analysis and outreach, mostly related to federal natural resources policy. And then we do communications work, largely through our blog and newsletter. And just a plug for our newsletter, the link to sign up for that is at the bottom of this slide if you're not signed up already, but can certainly send that out later on as well. Next slide. Yeah, so I wanted to highlight a few of our somewhat recent learning resources that might be of interest to folks. One is our Ideas to Action guidebook up on the upper right there. It's a good overview of tools and authorities that USDA uses, so NRCS and Forest Service, to support collaborative restoration. And it's kind of just good if folks are newer to the federal policy space, just get a sense for what some of the terminology and, again, kind of authorities and agreements that federal agency staff might be referencing in their work with partners. Somewhat newer is our Forest Service Planning to Implementation, or Project Planning to Implementation guidebook. That's the one highlighted in the center. And for folks working with the Forest Service, hopefully is a useful resource to kind of give an overview of what happens from pre-NEPA all the way through implementation and monitoring, and giving a good sense for maybe what's happening internal to the agency beyond what's happening through collaborative engagement. Also wanted to highlight some of our case study documents. Those include a look at a few large landscape partnerships and kind of what sort of governance documents they're using and how they're organizing themselves to work across larger landscapes, especially important as we're seeing agencies really want to scale up their landscapes of focus. Partners are kind of, yeah, still working through what that looks like to also operate and coordinate on larger scales. So there are a few examples highlighted there. Another one is looking at pathways to prescribed fire, kind of different examples of how smaller place-based collaborative or place-based organizations are engaged in cooperative prescribed fire activities. So obviously super important for ecological health and wildfire risk reduction, but also that community benefit aspect of getting kind of local workforce development and getting local workers engaged in this practice. I just wanted to give an overview of some of our key policy focus areas, one being prescribed fire. This is not my main subject area, but a colleague who's really involved in this is doing some edits to a new reintroduction of a National Prescribed Fire Act that we see a lot of promise in. Also looking at kind of highlighting ways that local level organizations that do have capacity to contribute to prescribed fire, really identifying those and getting those on federal agencies' radar. And then we have a number of different policy documents that are just different suggestions for ways to scale up prescribed fire. Again, is kind of a topic that we see is really important to a lot of different community-based organizations in the conservation space. We also have engaged in the Farm Bill and have a Farm Bill platform that I think some of you have contributed to, that's really focused on different strategies to support community-based and collaborative capacity through forestry and conservation programs and authorities. And so we've been meeting with congressional staff, just had a couple of meetings yesterday, and really have gotten some positive responses across the aisle to that concept of really building capacity at the local scale in order to best utilize and kind of equip rural communities to be competitive for federal dollars. So that's been a big kind of recent focus of ours, and definitely legislators are rolling up their sleeves. We're kind of in the final stages, I think, of really hammering out text. So still trying to stay engaged in that process. And then collaborative capacity support, kind of one of the things that I'm going to dive into a little bit more in this presentation, is an arena where we try to stay involved in different working group discussions, and then especially kind of tracking and helping support implementation of collaborative capacity support within the Forest Service. So again, kind of RVCC's focus has been more Forest Service focused and a little bit NRCS focused than focusing on kind of other federal agencies. But I did want to note, kind of zooming out to collaborative capacity policy, while it's not new news that this funding is somewhat hard to come by at the state and federal level, different working groups I've been a part of and kind of conversations that we've been having does seem to indicate a positive shift toward acknowledging at least the need to fund collaborative capacity. And I think I saw Deb Davidson on this call, but she's been really great about kind of keeping track of the America the Beautiful Challenge, hey Deb, and just kind of, yeah, some somewhat positive advancements in that second round of funding and what we're seeing in terms of planning grants and just the general focus of that funding challenge. So would love to, I don't know if you have anything to add on that end of things, but that seems to be at least one positive advancement in this space.
Just that there were some changes this year in terms of trying to make that planning grant a longer time period. So it's a 3-year planning grant opportunity this year. And part of that was to encourage or allow the opportunity for coordination to extend beyond that. Like the first year of funding, they only had it for 18 months. So if you were hiring a person, which you could have a coordinator to be part of the planning effort, was a short time period. So one of the things that a lot of us pushed for and they were able to make the shift was to make it a 3-year planning effort and more money. I do know that I did do reviews for the proposals, and there's 10 times what they can allocate though too. So it's incredibly competitive. And I think we'll be seeing the pre-proposals were done and reviewed, and the full proposal should be invited anytime if they haven't already.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Deb. Yeah, and just yesterday or the day before, I was looking at kind of an analysis of another program, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program out of NRCS. And that's another one that is kind of NRCS's hope to promote partnership-based approaches to some of their programs. And it's been pretty challenging for partners to access. And I think some positive changes have come out of the most recent funding notice, with some more flexibility and technical assistance, for example, and kind of the breakdown of that sort of funding, as well as a de-emphasis of partner contributions, match being a key barrier for kind of partners to access this program. So just kind of a few bright spots that I wanted to highlight in this realm of kind of collaborative capacity, community-based capacity building. Before I dive into kind of the main focus of RVCC's work related to collaborative capacity, which is this Forest Service component. So Allison, if you want to switch over to the next slide. Again, this is probably old news for some of you, but Ariana thought it was still important to kind of go over is just the realm of collaborative capacity support as it relates to the Forest Service. And this is perhaps what we've seen as the most direct congressional direction to for the agencies to invest in collaborative capacity. And that is particularly kind of the highlight is provision in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021 and dedication of $100 million to support of collaboration-based activities. That is landing in the Forest Services bucket, and part of it is going to support the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. But the agency is carving out part of that funding to stand up a collaborative capacity support program at the national scale. And wanted to provide kind of a little bit of an update on that, touched base with NFF this morning to get the latest. And so the overall goal is to foster, support, and grow capacity for forest stewardship efforts nationwide. And the funding is going to be kind of aiming to support 3 arenas: direct funding to collaboratives, technical assistance, and then support for some knowledge transfer and peer-to-peer learning. So those 3 components, again, related to forest restoration, kind of supporting forest restoration and management activities and kind of collaborative efforts around that, with an emphasis on tribes and underserved communities as a key focus. And in terms of rollout and timeline of that, NFF is just now standing up an advisory committee to help guide and provide input on program design. And so they're kind of anticipating funding to begin to be available in early 2024. And it's looking like that is going to be a multi-year program. They're anticipating kind of multiple years of funding from the Forest Service, but I think they're still uncertain about exactly what the dollar amount is going to be each year. I also wanted to highlight that Forest Service regional offices are getting kind of smaller buckets of funding on not a super regular basis, but they received $100,000 each last spring, and recently were offered up to $250,000. And so I think the takeaway from this money is just that Forest Service regional offices for folks engaged in collaborative efforts, maybe another contact to get in touch with if you're doing work that perhaps is at a broader scale or affects multiple collaboratives, because I think regional offices are either have funding or if they're offered additional funding in this bucket, would be looking for partners to work with. And then I think we're also seeing some interesting just more local level examples of Forest Service support for collaborative capacity. One that was highlighted at a recent conference and kind of has been interesting to follow, that John, I saw you on the call, knows a lot about, is in the Northern Colorado fire shed on Colorado's kind of Front Range. The Forest Service is working with the National Forest Foundation to develop an agreement that'll directly fund, they're calling it community connected partners across that Northern Colorado fireshed landscape, and a cool model where NFF is the fiduciary and then utilizing or relying upon a local advisory committee to deploy funding to these local collaborative groups to kind of help them move toward becoming implementation partners. So yeah, some cool things happening, and again, definitely a focus of RVCC's work to continue to track and support those different efforts. I'll also note a little bit wonkier, but the authority that enables the Forest Service to support collaborative efforts is a really important component of all of this. And for folks that work closely with the Forest Service, this is not new news, but it has been somewhat murky in recent years about whether the agency has the authority to use appropriated dollars to fund collaborative efforts. And it was a little bit kind of on a forest by forest or district by district interpretation, which kind of grants and agreements person you worked with. And so An important development is in the 2023 Omnibus Appropriations Law, so the big federal spending bill, there was inclusion of a provision that clearly gives the Forest Service this authority. And I pasted the text at the bottom of this slide to enter into cooperative agreements to support the work of forest or grassland collaboratives. So again, important clarity for that. Grants and agreements, and I think the National Partnership Office are still working on guidance for the agency about how to operationalize this authority. And for RVCC, an important priority is to ensure that this same language or something very similar gets included in additional or kind of either additional appropriations, farm bills, something that gives it more longevity, because right now it's tied to a 1-year spending bill, which isn't kind of necessarily the most stable ground to be on. So I think keep an eye out for this. This should just be an important authority to lean on for folks working directly with Forest Service districts and forests, and kind of trying to get support for collaborative efforts at that local scale. Accessing federal funding, obviously the question of the moment, and I don't think I have any super hot tips on that one, but wanted to just go over a few kind of tried and true pieces of advice that we have found in our own experience, and just from hearing from partners that, again, work closely with federal agencies. One being just to build relationships. Agencies are operating on extremely tight timelines to respond to funding opportunities. Sometimes it's like 3 or 4 days to put together some sort of proposal for how they might use money. So they're often, unfortunately, forced to rely upon, not unfortunately, but that they're relying upon established partners that they've worked with, existing agreements, et cetera. And so kind of starting to build relationships and just discuss like general project ideas is really valuable, so that agencies have something in their back pocket when these funding opportunities come along, if you are working through non-competitive grant mechanisms, for example. Creating flexible agreement structures is really important as well, so that those can be potentially modified if new funding or work comes along. And then this notion of teaming up. And I've heard several examples in Colorado and kind of in some working groups of just this idea of like entities, if you have smaller scale entities that maybe don't have the administrative capacity or just the wherewithal and knowledge to access these larger grant funding opportunities, really just kind of maybe teaming up with larger organizations to help get through that process is something that we've seen working well. A few resources that have come across my plate recently that may be useful and were highlighted in a couple of recent discussions, so others may be familiar as well. The Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership is putting together a pretty simple, but I think quite useful Google spreadsheet of different federal funding opportunities related to, I think in particular, the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So that's one place to go just to get kind of an overview of what's available and what's upcoming in terms of opportunities. The Conservation Program Explorer is a great resource for folks working in the Washington and parts of Oregon areas, where you just plug in your county, I believe, and it kind of pops up with a number of different state, federal, and local funding opportunities related to different types of restoration and conservation work. And then I'll just plug again RVCC's Ideas to Action guidebook as something that just gives a general sense for the tools and authorities to familiarize yourselves with that. Cool, and I think I will end on a question that is particularly, I think, relevant and timely as we're seeing funding, lots of federal funding, and with that, an associated level of accountability and kind of desire to make sure that this funding is having intended outcomes. And so there's going to be, I think, a lot of focus on how we can measure outcomes and evaluate success from collaborative capacity investments coming from the federal scale or from the federal level. And so just wanted to hopefully have some group discussion about that topic, and was looking through kind of some different programs that support collaborative efforts and trying to look at themes for how they are measuring outcomes and success. And it looks like things like collaborative dynamics, kind of asking about, is this funding really helping collaboratives develop these well-known elements of collaborative resilience and effectiveness, collaborative process outcomes are kind of another category of this sort of evaluation. And then also the socioeconomic and ecological outcomes and goals, and how our collaborative processes kind of connecting and producing those, are kind of some other general categories of outcomes and success monitoring. But kind of last slide, if you want to switch over to that, Allison, I can end my speaking portion, and just wanted to throw out a few questions that I think I'm pondering over, and we're kind of thinking about in our federal policy engagement on this topic of collaborative capacity funding. So happy to answer questions about anything that I've covered, or would love to hear thoughts about some of these questions or other topics related to collaborative capacity.
That was great. I appreciate it. So I'm Deb Davidson with the Center for Large Landscape Conservation and the Network for Landscape Conservation. And we, I just wanted to echo the work you're doing is so important, particularly with the Farm Bill, and hopefully we'll see some traction there. I just want to tell a little story. We run the Catalyst, the Landscape Conservation Catalyst Fund. And we just had 27 of our grantees gather in Albuquerque. So it was from 3 different cohorts, and it was so powerful. We were there for 4 days together and did some deep dive peer learning, as well as some travel to the Jemez Pueblo, which is one of our grantees. And I'm just bringing that up just to illustrate the power of these capacity building programs. These are all landscape partnership coordinators who feel very isolated. And some of you might be part of, I don't know there's a few smaller groups here I know that serve in a role like that. And the power of having people who are scattered across the country who feel very isolated, truly. They're like, we feel like we finally found our people, and we have a cohort. And the common theme that everyone's saying right now is both the need for skill set development and technical guidance on how to be an effective coordinator, and then how to access these federal funds or state funds or private, but particularly the federal funds right now, and how they feel very challenged by that. So one of the things we talked a lot about was trying to have more collaboration around that, and sharing of language for grant proposals, sharing of like best practices and things like that could help. Because people are feeling very frustrated and seeing these resources out there and not knowing how to access them. So, and I know that's a lot of the work that Emery's doing right now. It's a lot of the work that we're trying to do with our pushing of the National Landscape Partnership Fund, which is really a vision of a federally funded parallel effort to the Catalyst Fund, which is privately funded and can only serve, 14 groups a year. So, just emphasizing the need. And I feel like every meeting I'm in, and you guys are probably in the same boat, this is the root of our, I don't want to say problem, but it's the solution that we all know, if it was invested in more, could really turn the tide. And everyone from Robert Bonney, who I've now heard him say it in meetings that I've had with him, and then also larger meetings. Yeah, this is what we need, capacity, but we're not seeing that kind of translate down. So.
Yeah, and Deb, I think one of the things that I'm trying to also wade through is it an authority issue, or is it just like someone has established these expectations for programs issue? Kind of where is that barrier happening in terms of this notion that we can or won't be funding that capacity, collaborative capacity.
Well, the agencies that, we talk to say they do not have the funds at the moment for this kind of work because they want to see it go to implementation, and they feel a little bit hamstrung there, partially because of the way the language was written in certain legislation. Yeah, I mean, I think so I think that's one of them. And I think there's also an expectation that private funding would always come in, and which they have to a degree. We could see more. I mean, there's still a case to be made with private funders that this is one of the most important things they could invest in. And we see that through the NAP investments, they're not Native Americans for Philanthropy investments, though we still haven't seen that translate to funds going to these collaboratives. So I think it's both. I think it's still I think that somebody's like, oh, they're going to cover it. Oh, no, they're going to cover it. It's like little that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Deb, WCCN just finished a situation assessment, and call out to Rox and Barb's not here, but some folks helped with that. And similar to what you just said, I mean, our partners, we hear the same thing in terms of this need. So I feel like it's just so huge, and people are definitely communicating to us that same frustration that you mentioned. So really grateful to RBCC and the other organizations that are trying to unmuddy the water somewhat for all of us. So thank you for that, Emery, and anyone else working on that. Rox, you turned your camera on. I don't know if that means you had a thought or you just wanted to turn your camera on. I'm not meaning to call you out, but did you want to add anything?
No, I was thinking a lot of things, but what you brought up in your PowerPoint, the two struggles we've had with government funding down to get projects on the ground. One is we have been having a heck of a time in Southwest Wyoming, where a lot of the sagebrush money goes, to find a banking mechanism. Money is not a problem to get. It's finding a banking mechanism to go through to get the money on the ground. The only success we've had is through conservation districts. And in doing so, because they have good neighbor authority if it's a Forest Service project. And there's other means, if you already established a reputation. I mean, there's a number of things. We're dealing with it right now with 10 million from BLM that will get turned back if we don't figure out a way to do this. And so if things could, get a little bit looser at the top, which is always, hate to say it, that's the problem, is they either don't understand what they just developed, or they don't know how to get it down to the lower levels. And then the other thing is along those lines, you have such a turnover, like with the RCPP program, we have a huge award here that stretches Colorado to Wyoming. The problem has been like conservation easements. We have money in that. Nobody understands how to get that and how to do the process and get the paperwork done. And then at the DC level, they have such a turnover. And then down at the Wyoming level, a turnover. They don't get it, got to start all over. That's where you're getting hamstrung, is all these levels. But there's ways to do it, but it's difficult.
Thanks for that, Rox. And it sounds like by banking mechanisms, it's like an entity that can receive and then deploy that funding. Yeah, okay, at the local level.
Any other questions for Emery or thoughts? I think
Emery, just really quick, do you know when the TRCP, you called it they're putting together a public funding opportunities navigator? That's not done yet, is it?
It is, yeah. And
Okay.
I'm very happy to share the link.
Great.
It's linked in the PowerPoint, and so I can paste it in the chat box as well as send it out via email.
That's great. Thank you.
I really want to help them make that more robust. I think it's pretty New Mexico focused, because that's a really key area of interest. It includes a lot of federal programs, but it's New Mexico focused and somewhat water focused. So in talks with them right now about how we can build that out.
Sarah, I'm not, again, not calling out people who turn on their
No,
camera,
I
but
do- I guess I have no solutions, but I just have thoughts on the capacity piece of things, in that I think it just gets so underestimated how the relationship building foundation going into things works in terms of then instituting things on the ground. And, you know, everybody wants to fund projects on the ground, and that's what a lot of this federal money has come out for, but there's no way, you cannot just go and put a project out on the ground. That's not how it works. You have to have the relationships that are there first. And I think that when you're in kind of the NGO world, and you're working for funds and projects and that kind of stuff, that's a little bit of the different setup than some of the government stuff, or, you know, government job position, or just more like for-profit kind of stuff, where you have a position that's funded regardless and stuff, you know, you're kind of paid for the capacity things that happen anyway. And I think figuring out how to translate that to people is something, it just seems so obvious, but I feel like that's what's missing in the link of kind of how the money gets distributed. That if people aren't willing to fund the capacity stuff, then there's no way that you can fund the on the ground stuff, because there won't be on the ground stuff to do. Anyway, no solutions, but that's just in the vein of what you were throwing out there, Emery.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah.
John.
Two things quickly. First, Emery, that was an excellent presentation, just tons of information and also resources in a really concise and short amount of time. So thank you so much for that. Deb, to your question, I wanted to point out another resource that the state of Colorado Water Conservation Board manages. And I don't really know how useful this is, but it looks pretty comprehensive, both state, federal, and private opportunities. And I included a link there. It's a Google Doc, and they actually have a separate one about water opportunities, but this particular one is for forest health and fire mitigation projects. And it looks to me, I mean, I haven't done a really thorough analysis of how good it is, but it looks pretty comprehensive, and they do a pretty good job of maintaining it. I mean, the questions you all have been raising about how do you actually access these things, that's kind of a whole nother matter, but this seems like a pretty decent compilation of opportunities. So I wanted to make sure you all knew that that was available too. And it's not just Colorado. That spreadsheet, if you open up that link, it starts with Colorado opportunities, but if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see federal opportunities. Scroll down a little bit farther, you'll see private opportunities.
Yeah, John, now that you mentioned that, TRCP wasn't doing Colorado because they already knew that sort of comprehensive resource existed. So it's got kind of some validation from them as well.
Yeah, great.